Greetings, I'm Rabbi Gail Nord, and I'd like to invite you to session 3 of our series entitled Qoheleth, a most unusual book, in which we undertake an in-depth study of the biblical book of Qoheleth or Ecclesiastes in 6 weeks, taking 2 of the 12 chapters each week for our exploration. We move on this week to chapters 5 and 6. And I would invite you to have your text in front of you. It really doesn't matter what version, what translation you're using. As we found out at the weekly class upon which this video is based, it's interesting to actually use different versions, different translations to see how they compare. I'm using the Jewish Publication Society translation. So before we get started on Qoheleth, very recently, I saw a new movie entitled Bridge of Spies, starring Tom Hanks, which is a Cold War era spy thriller based, as they say, on actual events. I enjoyed the movie very much. I think it's worth seeing. As I ruminated on this movie afterwards, I particularly, in the light of Qoheleth, was thinking about the Soviet spy character named Rudolph Abel. And if you haven't seen it, Tom Hanks plays initially his defense attorney when Abel is caught as a Soviet spy in the United States and put on trial and ultimately could be getting the death penalty. Later, Tom Hanks takes the role of negotiator as Rudolph Abel is swapped for Gary Francis Powers, who was the U-2 spy plane pilot who was shot down over the Soviet Union. Now, this Rudolph Abel, the Soviet spy, was a very calm man, you might say. He, despite the peril that he was in, he kept his center, remained calm throughout. And maybe 3 different times in the course of the movie, the Tom Hanks character says something to him along the lines of, "Aren't you worried?" Mr. Abel's response in each case was, "Would it help? Are you worried? Does it help?" I wonder what Qoheleth would have to say about that response. I think that he would like it because, as we have seen, he says everything comes in its own time. There are certain things over which we do not have control, and focusing ourselves on those matters is hevel, is a waste of time, is vapor, is less than nothing. Better that you should just relax, enjoy your day, do good, and take pleasure in what God has given you. So, see the movie. See what you think. Now, chapters 5 and 6 begin a section of wise advice, of teachings and counsels of how to live our lives. And as we begin chapter 5, it starts with some advice about our mouth or our tongue, how we should and should not use our speech. It tells us that we should not be quick to speak. We should not speak overmuch. And particularly, it says we should not be quick to bring forth speech before God. Don't say overmuch before God. Well, now how do we interpret that? Do we not go on and on with prayers? That could be part of it. And what he says, "For God is in heaven and you are on earth," that is why your words should be few. Perhaps saying this whole dichotomy that he's been talking about with the under the sun, the Dakat HaShamayim, implying the over the sun, that we don't really know what's going on in that realm. And if we speak over much, we might be treading on that territory that really is beyond our knowing and, in a sense, is none of our business. We just should tend to the business that we have on earth. So too much speech leads to foolishness. Then he goes on with a section about making vows before God. Now, this isn't something that probably is as common today as it was perhaps back in the day of Qoheleth, but perhaps it would be like making a promise, a really heartfelt promise that we intend to keep. Some people certainly do maybe not make vows with God, but it's kind of a bargaining with God. God, if you let this happen, I will do this, this, and this. I certainly have seen that happen in my spiritual counseling work, that people in an effort to maintain control of a situation which they feel is out of control get into this bargaining position vis-a-vis God, which if I were asked, I would certainly counsel against. Better to put your trust in God rather than try to manipulate or control God by making promises which you may or may not be able to keep. So it says, however, if you do make a vow before God, don't hesitate or do not delay to fulfill it. Just do what you say, which is good advice in life, isn't it? Don't make promises that you don't intend to keep. If someone asks something of you that you are not able to fulfill, don't promise it. As I've gotten older, one of the words I've learned to use is the no word. Is to be able to say no to things that are not appropriate, or that I know I'm not going to have the time or energy to do. And then that frees one up to say yes to the things that are appropriate and significant. And you relieve a lot of stress in your life when you give yourself permission to say no when it's time to say no. Now, it does say here that we should fear God, that we should be in awe of God, that we should respect God. Don't anger God by much talk or inappropriate talk, because God might be angry, and we might suffer as a result of our foolish and hasty words. Now, he moves on in chapter 5, verse 7, saying, if you see in a province oppression of the poor and suppression of right and justice, don't wonder at the fact. For one high official is protected by a higher one, and both of them by still higher ones. Thus, the greatest advantage in all the land is this: he controls a field that is cultivated. I take that to mean he has means, he has money, he has the power and the ability to control events, at least under the sun. So he takes oppression of the poor and suppression of right and justice as simply a given, as part of the way of the world, of the Takat HaShemayim. And I'm hard pressed to think of a situation or a governmental system where there is not injustice and iniquity and oppression of the poor. Now, I don't think that means that we should take those things blithely and not work for justice in all our ways. We should be kind, we should be good, we should do what we can, but don't be surprised at it. We shouldn't spend our times clucking our tongues and, oh, terrible, terrible, terrible. Better to do something. Lead your life justly. Be as good as you can from day to day. Do what you can in your own little realm. Now, certainly there are those who are called to the world stage. Most of us are not. So when we see oppression, when we see injustice, don't be surprised, but be good and be kind and do what you can. In verse 11, he counsels those who have too much. The rich man, he says, a worker or a slave's sleep is sweet, whether he has much or little to eat, but the rich man's abundance doesn't let him sleep. And here it's probably not saying because he eats too much rich food he can't sleep. It's more when you have a lot of stuff, you have a lot of worries. And isn't that the truth? The more things you have, the more trouble you have, the more things you have to take care of, the more you have to worry about. It's fall here in Minnesota. It's October, and I am in the season. I have a fairly large yard, and I'm in the season of doing outdoor maintenance. And there are times when I think, oh my goodness, as much as I love my yard, it is a lot of work. And there are times when I think, well, maybe it'll be time to downscale. So there's not so much that one has to maintain. It takes a lot of time. The more you have, the more worries you have, the more, in a sense, it begins to oppress you. In a sense, it's more things, more time. Anyway, so here's an interesting teaching which has come into our popular culture. Listen to this. This is verse 5:14, and follow along in your version. He's going into a section of grave evils. This is a grave evil, or a really bad thing, something to definitely avoid. First, he talks about hoarding riches. We've heard about that before. But here's another one. Another grave evil or bad thing is this: he must depart just as he came. As he came out of his mother's womb, so he must depart at last, naked as he came. He can take nothing of his wealth to carry with him. So what is the good of all the toiling for the wind? Besides, all his days he eats in darkness, with much vexation and grief and anger. So we come into this world with nothing, we leave with nothing, and we've all heard the phrase, you can't take it with you. So Qoheleth says, so then what's the point of spending your days toiling for more than you need? We all need food and clothing and shelter, and some extra funds for entertainment, for gifts, for things that bring pleasure to our lives. But he's really talking about, don't make that the center of your meaning, the heaping up and the making of money, and simply spending all your time doing that and not giving yourself the pleasure of enjoying your days, because it's all going to be gone. You can't take it with you. So now we're seeing in verse 17, he tells us once again what is good. So here's what's not good, here's what's good. Only this I have found or seen, it's his observation, is a real good. And then this good could be almost seen as beautiful or appropriate. This is what is a beautiful, appropriate way to live your life. One should eat and drink and get pleasure with the gains he makes under the sun during the numbered days of life that God has given them. So in other words, remember that your days are numbered. There's another famous saying, which is also echoed in Psalm 90, verse 12, where it says, teach us to remember or to count our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Remember that your days are numbered. Now, this can certainly be a distressing thought for many people, to think that, oh my gosh, that I am going to leave this world. I am going to die. But if we can walk in an awareness, a non-fearful, non-anxious awareness of this, then our lives will be more in perspective. We can be more centered in this day and find more joy, and certainly live without fear. Not in the way that you should go step in front of a bus, God forbid, but just knowing that this isn't going to last forever, so don't hang on to anything too tightly. Enjoy what you have today. All right. Okay, and he counsels us not to brood. Now we move on to verse 6, or chapter 6. There's another evil, and this is telling us that sometimes God grants a man riches, property, and wealth. So it's suggesting here that the gains that we have in life are really not our doing. That indeed everything comes from the hand of God, and so what we are given comes from God. It's, we may work for it, but it is God who permits us to gain these riches. So he doesn't want for anything. His appetite may crave. Talking about craving, which is really not a positive. But God does not permit him to enjoy it. Instead, a stranger will enjoy it. This is futility, hevel, and a grievous ill. So you spend all your energy for nothing. Basically, you waste your days on nothing. Even if a man should beget 100 children and live many years, no matter how many the days of his years may come to, if his gullet is not sated. And now this word gullet, which in this translation, it's actually nephesh, which is one of the words in Hebrew for spirit, or kind of life force, seed of emotions. So it's really a part of what makes us alive. If that life force is not sated through his wealth, and this is a hard saying. Listen to this in the second half of verse 3. The stillbirth, though it was not even accorded of burial, is more fortunate than he. Though it comes into futility and departs into darkness, and its very name is covered with darkness. Though it has never seen or experienced the sun, it is better off than he. Yes, even if the other lived 1,000 years twice over, but never had his fulfill of enjoyment. For are not both of them bound for the same place? Wow. So he's saying again, and he's reiterating what he'd said before. It's actually better not to be born than to live this empty life of hevel, of pursuing after wind, of doing that which is absolutely meaningless. Better that you weren't here. That's a pretty harsh indictment of the choices that we can make in life, or choices that we fall into, or something that can even become habitual. All of man's earning is for the sake of his mouth, yet his gullet, yet his nephesh is not sated. In other words, there's no end to acquisition. What advantage then has the wise man over the fool? What advantage is the pauper who knows how to get on in life? In other words, a pauper who knows how to deal with it, knows how to be grateful and live even though he doesn't have much. Now, I remember many years ago doing a presentation, I don't remember what the topic was, for a group of senior citizens, and we began a conversation about their lives back when they were young, back when they were children. And I heard several of them say, we were poor, but we were happy. In other words, saying that in a sense, their early lives, their simple lives were, you might even say, one gets a sense that they were happier than they were when they were more prosperous. And afterwards I thought, okay, we were poor, but we were happy. What if you changed that conjunction and said we were poor and we were happy? We didn't have we had, in a sense, to worry about, but we had different things to worry about. And maybe there was a more of a contentment in living a simple life. I grew up in a small town in northern Minnesota, and there weren't really wealthy people there. There were a few who had more, like the professionals, the doctors and the dentists, but no one really lived a hugely different standard of living. Everybody lived a fairly simple life. And, there's something to think about there. All right, so let's look at the grand finale of chapter 6. We're going to read verse 10 through 12. Whatever happens, it was designated long ago, and it was known that it would happen. As for man, he cannot contend with what, or him, really, who is stronger than he. So, in a sense, our lives are outlined, at least by God. I don't think God necessarily chooses what we're going to have for dinner in that detail, but what would happen, in other words, the outcome, is known and planned. Often, much talk means much futility. So kind of the summary of this chapter. How does it benefit a man? Who can possibly know what is best for a man to do in life? The few days of his fleeting life? For who can tell him what the future holds for him under the sun? To me, that's a caution against worry, and goes back to that statement, aren't you worried? Would it help? No, it will not help. It doesn't say we shouldn't be prudent. We need to be prudent. We need to plan. But to spend our days in worry, it doesn't gain anything. Regret and worry are the killers of the soul. So I would say, my friends, be grateful, be happy, do good,